So welcome. This is our snippet for the week of the 6th. Get right to the questions. There were a lot of good questions for this week. Thank you. So a bunch of people had questions about Italy's role in World War I, which clearly the instructor did not cover either sufficiently or well enough in the snippet. So these were three of the questions. How did the Italians eventually wind up in conflict along the Alpine border with the Austrians? What was Italy's role in World War I? How did Italy's eventual entry affect the war? So these are all, I think, good questions relating to this sort of odd participant in World War I. So we remember that we had the map with Italy aligned with the Germans and the Austrians. But when war is declared, even though every other member of an alliance goes along with the pre-war alliance, Italy announces that it's going to remain neutral. And for the next year or so, there's basically a bidding war between the Central Powers, that's the group headed by Germany, and the Allies, headed by the British and the French, as to which side Italy is going to enter the war on. And eventually in 1915, back up a second. Part of the problem here for Germany is that Italy wanted something concrete from the war. That is, that they wanted an ability to expand territorially. And the territories that they particularly wanted, parts of modern-day Slovenia and Croatia, were parts of Austria-Hungary. Obviously, Austria-Hungary is not going to give part of its own territory to Italy. So once Italy backs out of the alliance, it becomes much more likely that Italy, if it enters the war, it's going to enter the war on the side of the Allies, which ultimately it does. In one of the most infamous, maybe the most infamous of the secret treaties of World War I, the Treaty of London of 1915. And under the terms of this treaty, Italy agrees to enter the war on the side of the Allies. The Allies agree at the end of the war to give Italy the territories here in light green, so the basically the Dalmatian coast on the Adriatic. Moreover, Serbia is, along with Montenegro, which is sort of an ally of the Serbians, is promised a significant portion of territory in modern-day Bosnia and Croatia, which then was part of Austria-Hungary. So as a result, Italy gets into the war. Now this treaty, it's significant for another reason. In effect, what the Allies are doing is saying that one of their war aims is they're committed to the dismemberment of Austria-Hungary. A bit later in the war, they'll also support independence for Czechoslovakia in the northern part of Austria-Hungary. It makes it really hard to do a compromise peace when your war aim is, destroying the existence of one of the belligerents. So the treaty has a very negative effect on sort of the nature of international diplomacy and the possibilities of a negotiated peace that will end World War I, although that doesn't become apparent for another couple of years. So in any case, once Italy signs the treaty, Italy enters the war. And as the first of the questions that we had for this week points out, basically all of Italy's fighting was in this very, very tough area, high up in the Italian Alps, on the border with Austria-Hungary. And this is a map of the military surge is not the correct word, penetration by the Austrians during the war. And what should be striking, I think, about this map, so the areas in purple are areas that the Austrian troops advanced into Italian territory, is that this is it's a brutal war that's fought over, tiny portions of territory. The Italians are not particularly well led militarily. The Austrians aren't either, and you have millions of men fighting in this very tough terrain. More than 500,000 Italian soldiers die, about the same number of Austrians. It's very hard to see Italy having a major effect on the war. They bogged down these Austrian troops. That's about it. The expectation when Italy enters the war is that on the part of the Allies is that would tip the balance, make it harder for Austria to meaningfully engage in the war, and maybe require Germany to defend itself from the south as well. That doesn't turn out to be the case. And by the end of the war, and I'll be talking more about this in the snippets to come, there's a degree of enmity between Italy and the Western powers, especially the British, who really, don't think they kind of got what they bargained for. And there's this Winston Churchill joke, perhaps apocryphal, but it's such a good joke. In the run-up to World War II, he's told by the German ambassador, if there is a war, it's going to go better for the Germans this time, in part because we'll have Italy on our side this time. And Churchill's supposed response to this was, well, that's only fair because we had Italy the last time. So the sense that Italy really was not a major military force, which turned out to be true in World War II as well. So there are, I think one of the things about World War I is that there are a lot of these subsidiary fronts. It's a Russian-Turkish front in modern day Armenia and Azerbaijan. There's a Balkan front. There's a Romanian front, and there's this Italian Austrian front. And there's also fighting in East Asia between the Japanese and the Germans and the Chinese. So this is a world war, even though I think when we think about World War I, for understandable reasons, we generally only think of the Western Front in France and the Eastern Front between Germany and Russia. So that's a quickie summary of Italy. One final thing: the Italians, those of you who are experts in geography know that after the war, Italy is not going to get this territory. There's no map of Italy any time in the 20th century that gives Italy this portion of then Yugoslavia, now modern day Slovenia and Croatia, and a bitterness about this in part paves the way for a nationalist backlash, which contributes to Mussolini's coming to power in 1922. Second question, this was a really interesting question, about the rise of nationalism across Europe as one of the catalysts for World War I, focused on the ethnic demographics of the nations. This concept is nationalism exclusive to those who have an ethnic background and history in the places they call home, or can the modern definition of pride in one's country still apply? Again, I think it's a very good question. In the context of the late 19th and early 20th century, I think nationalism has this more discrete definition that's very much tied to a combination of ethnic homogeneity and the land. And the best part of the continent to get a sense of how this played out was in the Balkans, here in southeastern Europe, which is obviously the starting point for World War I with the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, but is the most unstable portion of Europe as a whole, caused largely by the gradual retreat of the Ottoman Empire. Here in yellow on this map. This map is from 1903, and in 1800. All of the areas that I'm tracing now with my cursor, they were under Ottoman control, and gradually the Ottomans decline. And into this vacuum emerges this nationalist battle among the peoples of the Balkans, which is an ethnically polyglot part of the world in 1900. It's very, very difficult to draw a map, for instance, where every Serb in the Balkans would live in Serbia, because some of these areas have Bosnians and Croats and Macedonians, Albanians, ditto with Bulgaria, ditto with Romania, ditto even with Greece. So there are two significant wars in the Balkans, the First and Second Balkan Wars, one in 1912, one in 1913. In some ways, you can think of the start of World War I as the Third Balkan War, but of course, this one expands dramatically. And the Second Balkan War ends with a very different map where Turkey is basically driven out of Europe. Bulgaria is given access to the Mediterranean. A newly created buffer state of Albania emerges, overwhelmingly Albanian and Muslim, out of a desire mostly by the Austrians, to ensure that Serbia doesn't have access to the sea, and Romania gradually expands its territory as well. The problem, of course, is that none of these lines are ethnically homogeneous, and so the First Balkan War of 1912, which is all of these countries against the Turks, leading to the creation of Albania, gives way to the Second Balkan War of 1913, which is Serbia, Greece, and Romania against Bulgaria. You can see here this 1913, Bulgaria has to cede part of its territory to Romania. Ditto here on the Bulgarian-Serbian border. So nationalism has this problematic play out during the period, and it's largely seen as an ethnic vision rather than a kind of pride in country. And that's true, I think, to a certain extent, even in the United States in the run up to World War I. There are lots of reasons why Wilson pushes the idea of neutrality in 1914. But one is that the United States in 1914 is a country with a very significant percentage of first generation immigrants, people who have real cultural, familial, ideological ties to Europe. And there's a concern on Wilson's part that if the United States, say, aggressively enters the war on the side of the Allies, that could alienate not just German Americans, but also Irish Americans, because Ireland is a colony of Britain at this point, and Scandinavian Americans who, for a variety of reasons, tend to, if not tilt towards the Allies, towards the Central Powers, tend to prefer a more neutralist course to the war. So while it's true you have this, it's a more ethnically polyglot country, the U.S. than many of these countries in Europe. There are similar patterns at the time, and I don't think the kind of more modern understanding of nationalism that we saw from the question really applies at this point. And then the last question was on Wilson's peace without victory idea. And this too it's a really good question. Was this policy Wilson truly believed in, considering what we see after World War I? And I think the answer to that question is yes, Wilson did believe in it, but there were two sort of critical errors. One, not Wilson's fault. The other, I think, probably was Wilson's fault. The one that wasn't Wilson's fault, the U.S. leverage over Britain and France. Remember, Britain and France, and I'll talk more about this in the snippets, they're committed to a harsher peace. The U.S. leverage comes basically from its money. The U.S. is financing the British and French economies by 1916, 1917, because so much of their domestic resources are going to the war effort. So U.S. exports to the Allies dramatically increases, and U.S. loans to the Allies help keep them afloat. The problem here is that once the war ends, this leverage becomes much less significant. If the U.S. cuts off its loans to France in 1919, well, the French have already won the war, so they don't have these approaches. So I think what Wilson doesn't understand, Wilson believes, one of his rationalizations for entering the war is that will make it easier for the U.S. to have a seat at the peace table. What Wilson fails to recognize is that once the war is over, the U.S. will lose lots of its leverage to pressure the British and the French to adopt a more peace without victory oriented peace. And then the second, there's this just incredibly good new book. We have it in the library. It's on Kindle for those of you who are interested in this period, by Philip Zelikow, called The Road Less Traveled, which came out earlier this year. And what Zelikow does, looking at some new documents, but also just sort of reinterpreting the documents that existed. In this book, he makes two primary arguments. The first is that a compromise peace, he contends, was genuinely possible in 1916 and 1917, but the failure to deliver that compromise peace, according to Zelikow, in part came from Wilson, sort of odd and wavering and inconsistent diplomacy. So yes, Wilson was committed to the idea of peace without victory, but he can't deliver it after the end of World War I because the U.S. has lost its leverage. And when the U.S. did have its leverage at this point in 1916 and 1917, he's basically an incompetent diplomat, if you buy the Zelikow argument, which I do, and it made it hard for him to translate his ideas into reality. So that's what we have for the Q&A for this week.